My name is Dan Anderson. I was the provincial archivist for St. John the Baptist province in Cincinnati for a number of years. I'm the only artifact I brought for this demonstration. I say that half-jokingly because I think if you go through any archives, and certainly the archives of a religious community, it is the friars who have been members of that community who are the history. I teach the history of our province to our postulants every year. And we always start in the archives building, and I'll open the doors, and it's a very nice archives. The province decided in the 90s to really invest in the preservation. It had been collected, but not very well conserved and very, very inaccessible. And they decided to invest in that and invested in a nice archives building. Ellen has been there, Jack's done research there. But I always tell them, as they look at rows upon rows of boxes, if you start here and end up over here, you'll know the province history by reading the correspondence, the letters of each person. And I think that's an important part of what we have. You came with a chemistry background. I came to being archivist. My master's degree is in theater. I taught high school speech and theater for a little over 20 years, and then was director of a theater company, and the board and I saw things differently, the board of the theater company. So I was unemployed for a couple of months, and one of the guys I lived with was Murray Bodo, who's a Franciscan writer, and he had been to our archives trying to do some research. And that night at supper, he was complaining about how hard it was to find anything. And I very boldly and brazenly said, well, then somebody should just clean it up. I was living with our vicar provincial at the time, and the next day he suggested I be the one to do that. With a background in theater, my first goal was to make it pretty. But I very quickly realized I had a whole lot to learn. And I never learned everything I could, but studied at the National Archives and learned some of the just technical skills. But most of all, I learned the value of what we had. And my already kind of anal personality was just intrigued by keeping that as a resource for others. We have the same things any other province or religious community archives would have, the personnel records and all of that, which are fascinating and truly are the history of our province. But just to point out a couple of things that may be of interest beyond us, we came here in 1844. The German-speaking population of Cincinnati exploded during that whole mid-19th century immigration movement. And the bishop of the relatively new diocese of Cincinnati made several tours through German-speaking Europe trying to recruit priests, and finally came to the province of St. Leopold in the Tyrol, which at various times, depending on which war has just been won, was Italy or Germany or Austria or whoever won the last war. But that Tyrolese area, our guys came from there, and they came primarily to minister to the German-speaking immigrants. And if you look at a map of our early movement, as the numbers of friars began to grow, you can see where the German immigration was moving. And we pretty much followed that. You talked about amicable anarchists. Several, not too many years, about 10 years after the guys got here, and by this time they were going by riverboat from Cincinnati to Louisville, Kentucky, and to Pomeroy, Ohio, which is about 300 miles the other way. I mean, just all over the place. And this is just a handful of guys doing this ministry. The powers that be in Tyrol decided that it was a valiant effort, but there were no vocations, and it was time to come home. It had been a good effort, but a failure. And the guys basically said no. And he said, well, you will come home. And so they went to the bishop, and he said, my God, don't leave. And he pulled some strings in Rome, and to make a long story short, we won, lost, whatever the right word is, but we stayed and formed the custody and then the province of St. John the Baptist. As inevitably what happened is we began to move into other areas. Bishops who had non-German speaking populations were saying, hey, you got a couple extra guys, we could use them in our place. So that very strong German identity quickly diminished. But while we still had that identity, Katharine Drexel, now Saint Katharine Drexel, and when you read her correspondence, you wonder why. No, she was an amazing woman, but a control freak. Katharine Drexel was looking for somebody to come out and start a mission on the Navajo reservation. And through a couple of friends who knew friends, she ended up in Cincinnati. The story is, and I kind of believe this from reading the correspondence, that she had tried to make an appointment to come and talk to our provincial many, many times, and she was always put off. So she showed up one day, and the provincial had the flu or something, and so she just camped out until he came down, and convinced our province to send the first 3 missionaries out to what is now St. Michael's Mission. And the guys were German-speaking who kind of knew English, but were assured that all of the Navajos spoke English, that there was a very, very nice building that could be used as their residence in their chapel. And so they took the train to Gallup, took a wagon from Gallup out to what is now St. Michael's, and found when they got there that there was the original mission building without a roof, that in fact none of the Navajos spoke English. So these Germans who learned English taught themselves by investing themselves in the lives of the Navajos how to speak Navajo, but more importantly, what it meant to be Navajo, what the culture was, what the religious beliefs were. And we had a researcher from Brigham Young University, Howard Barr, who did quite a bit of work in our archives about those early friars and the ones that followed for several years after that. And he was just wowed. And one of the things I was impressed with as the archivist, or not impressed with, but delighted with, is to see our men through somebody else's eyes. I found that with Ellen when she was doing research, but he was wowed by the fact that the ecclesiology and missiology of these early missionaries was 100 years ahead of its time. And so anyway, we have pretty extensive holdings on the correspondence relating to the beginnings of what eventually was spawned as the daughter province, Our Lady of Guadalupe. Because we came in 1844 as part of the immigrant movement, I think our archives are also one of many resources on that whole nativist movement, or the Know-Nothing movement that was part of that period of history that in many ways we see repeated now with people from the Hispanic speaking people that are coming into the country and from other places. But the letters that our guys would write back to the Tyrol about their experience. The first man to come over, William Untertina, wrote back from the harbor in New York when he landed. He said, and I don't remember all the nationalities in the right order, but basically, you know, the Irish cheat the Italians cheat the French cheats cheat the Germans, and all the Americans cheat everybody that's not. And I think, you know, that was a very early, his early reflection on that whole movement that our guys and the population that they served faced. So I do think our holdings are really very worthwhile as at least the Ohio Valley experience, Catholic experience of that nativist movement. Well, any of our archives, again, I think would be reflective of the struggles that all religious communities went through after the Second Vatican Council, of trying to do two things: reclaim our original charism of our founder, Francis, with documents that had only very recently come to light, but also to understand what it was to be religious, to be Franciscans, to be ministers in a church that was undergoing change. And we have extensive minutes and publications of just endless meetings that we had. One of the sociologists that worked with this identified condition red, which was the multifaceted conflicts that were going on between the younger and the older members of the province, between the ordained and the non-ordained members of the province, between the guys from the Southwest who wanted to escape the sauerkraut curtain around Cincinnati and came out here. There's all these different things. And I do think that's a valuable resource of kind of at least one group of religious experience of what it was to try to embody what the church was calling us to as a result of the Second Vatican Council. One of the, I'm out of time, but just to say this, one of the huge learning experiences I had was that we moved the archives while I was the archivist into a new building. And so I'd say almost literally, I touched everything that was in the archives. And just to do that, first of all, I knew what we had in a way that I never would have learned without having done that. But I began to appreciate that this is part of me and I am part of this. And if this is lost, there's a huge gift, not just to the Franciscans, but to the church and to our culture that is lost. And I think that's one of the great values that an archives can bring. So thanks.